Hi, my name's Virginia Smith. I am super disappointed that I am not going to be able to meet you in person at the Owen County Library event. I was really looking forward to that. It's a crazy world we live in, isn't it? Today, the good people at the library have made it possible for some of us authors to record a video to talk to you about maybe some of the same things we would have talked about if we'd been able to meet in person. And today I am going to talk to you about my latest book. It is called The Last Drop of Oil. Can you see it? Um, it is my 38th novel. I can hardly believe it when I say that number. It just seems like the other day that I sold my first novel, but 38. And it's a different book for me. I have mostly lately, I have been writing cozy mysteries and romantic suspense. In the past, I have written Christian fiction, contemporary mostly, a couple of historical fiction, but really most of my work has been mysteries. And I had never written biblical fiction before, and that's what this is. That's not exactly true. I did write a biblical novel once several years ago. It's called The Days of Noah, and obviously it takes place in the time of the great flood of Genesis, the time of Noah's Ark. And this book, though, has a little science fiction element, so it's not strictly what they call biblical fiction, but I loved it, and it was a lot of fun, and I am kind of a science fiction fantasy geek anyway, so this was a fun book. But when the Guideposts publisher people contacted me, and that is the publisher of this book is Guideposts, and they said, we're going to launch a new series called Ordinary Women of the Bible. And there will only be 8 books, and they contacted 8 different authors, each to write one of the books. And I was so honored that they contacted me, but because biblical fiction isn't really anything I'm known for or have done before, I'm like, are you sure you want me? And she said, yes, we would like that. And so I thought, what fun. It would be a lot of fun. So I agreed, and I had worked with the editor at another publisher, and I just love her. So I was excited to work with her again. So they contracted a book from me, and I had to pick an ordinary woman character from the Bible to have the book be about. And of course, the first one I said was, oh, I want to do Noah's wife. And she said, sorry, that one's already taken. I think that was the first or second book in the series. My book is the 5th book in the series. And I said, okay, what can I do? And my editor suggested The Widow of Zarephath. Well, I like that story. I like that biblical story. So I said, okay, I'll do The Widow of Zarephath. Now, let me give you just a little bit of recap. The story is in 1 Kings chapter 17, and there's only 17 verses about this section of the Bible. There's 17 verses where the widow of Zarephath comes into play. And the story is about the prophet Elijah, a man of God he was a prophet during the reign of King Ahab of Israel. And Ahab had married a Phoenician princess named Jezebel. And Jezebel was a pagan worshiper. She worshiped pagan gods, Baal mostly. And so when Jezebel came to Israel, she brought her pagan god worship with her and all of her pagan priests. And King Ahab allowed that to happen and even joined with her and encouraged the people of Israel to worship pagan gods and Baal. And shrines to these gods popped up all over Israel. And God was not happy that his people were worshiping other gods. And so he sent Elijah to King Ahab to say, you better stop it. And he warned him several times. And then Elijah said, there's going to be a drought for years. There will be no rain falling on this land until I give the word. And he spoke for God. And boy, that really made Ahab and Jezebel angry. And so Jezebel especially started, she says, we're going to kill him. And so God sent Elijah into hiding. And first he sent him into the wilderness and fed him miraculously. And then there was a river in the ravine where he was staying. And when the river dried up because of the drought, God sent Elijah to a village called Zarephath. Now, Zarephath the Bible tells us that Zarephath was in the region of Sidon. And that's important to remember. So Elijah goes to Zarephath, and as he's walking in, and God had told him this would happen, as he is walking in right in front of the gates of the town, there was a widow, a woman, and she was gathering sticks, gathering wood to go home and build a fire. And Elijah asked her for water and bread. And she said, "Sir, I'm a poor widow, and all I have left, we're starving, and all I have left is a handful of grain and a few drops of oil. And I was getting ready to gather this wood and go home and make a fire and make a cake of bread for my son and I, and this will be our last meal, and then we're going to die." And Elijah said, "If you make me a cake of bread," and basically the offer of bread at that point was an invitation for hospitality. So he was saying, if you'll let me come in and stay with you, then your jar of grain will never get empty and your jug of oil will never go dry. And she agreed. So Elijah went and stayed with her. Now, this took place in the 8th century BC. The biblical account, as I said, is only 17 verses. The widow and her son are never even given a name. And today, Zarephath is a ruin. Now, I'm a firm believer in research. I believe that good fiction has a basis in fact. If you're going to write a book about, like, a scuba diver, which I did, you better know something about scuba, which I do. If you're going to write a book set in, say, Lexington, Kentucky, and you've never been there, you better be doing some research so you know the name of the streets and the stores where your character may visit. And so I think research is vital. In every book I write, I spend a ton of time researching. And then to me, the research is the foundation. And once I have that foundation, then the creative brain takes over and I start building the story on that foundation. But how in the world do you go about researching something that took place almost 3,000 years ago and doesn't exist anymore? Thank goodness for the internet. Zarephath was a town in Phoenicia, in the region of Sidon, which was Phoenicia. And it was located, Zarephath was located about 8 miles south of Sidon. Now, the king of that country, his palace was in Sidon. And guess who that king's daughter was? It was the princess Jezebel. Jezebel was the Phoenician princess. So she was raised in the palace just 8 miles north of Zarephath. So isn't it interesting when you think that the widow of Zarephath, if she was raised in Zarephath, she was raised knowing Princess Jezebel, probably even looked up to her and wanted to be like her. Zarephath was excavated in 1969 to 72 by a guy from the University of Pennsylvania. And I read that excavation report, kind of dry reading because, I don't know a whole lot about archaeology, but I picked up a couple of facts that were just fascinating to me. First of all, 2 of the primary businesses of Zarephath were pottery making, and they were manufacturers of purple dye. Now, the purple dye was because Zarephath was located on the sea. It was a seaside town, and there are a specific kind of mollusk that produce this dye, and they're only located in that area. So Zarephath was known for their purple dye, and they were known for pottery. This excavation actually unearthed 22 kilns. For a little town, 22 kilns. One of them, they dated back to the 13th century BC. So Now I'm starting to get kind of a picture of the widow's society and the town in which she lives. Also, Zarephath is occupied two promontories, and each of them had a good harbor. So it's safe to assume that some of the people were fishermen and that the people's diet included fish. So when I started getting an idea of the village, that's part of the foundation. But what about the widow? She's the main character of my story, but in the Bible, she doesn't even have a name. Now, here's where the creative brain takes over. I had some facts, so then I start building on that foundation. And I do that by asking questions. Why was the widow starving? Yes, they were several years into a drought, but the town was a fishing town with two harbors. That wouldn't be affected by a drought. So if she was starving, that had to mean she wasn't able, for some reason, to buy fish. Was it because she was poor, but she owned a house? So maybe the people of the town wouldn't sell her food. Maybe she was being ostracized for some reason. That's kind of an interesting what if, don't you think? And another thing, how old was she? When I think of widows in the Bible, I, for some reason, think of older women. I'm not sure why, but this widow had a son who wasn't out helping her gather firewood for their last meal. So, and apparently he wasn't old enough to go fishing. So he must have been pretty young, which means she might have been young too. So, how did her husband die? We know that pottery was one of the major occupations. Maybe he owned a kiln. Well, here's the thing. A few years ago, I wrote a book about a potter. And as part of my research, it was called The Amish Widower, by the way. As part of my research, I took pottery lessons for quite a while and threw some pretty good pots, actually. So I knew about that. So when I read about the kilns, I'm like, I have knowledge about this. I can do this. And so maybe the husband owned a kiln. And what if there was an accident in the kiln and he died? Okay, so now my widow's life is starting to take shape. She was the wife of a potter, a business owner. So why is she being ostracized? What if the townspeople suspect her of having something to do with the accident that killed her husband? Oh, now we've got a good conflict that's starting to develop in my mind. And then, of course, there's the miracle of the grain and the oil. And then later on, the first recorded resurrection of a dead person in the Bible takes place in this woman's own home. Um, so what I ended up with was a story that is faithful in every way to the account that we read in the Bible, and yet it's also faithful to the facts that I uncovered during my research, and yet it's fiction. I named my lady, I wanted a really cool name. So I tried to research Phoenician language. Well, it's really interesting. Phoenicians, their language was spoken but not written. It didn't have any vowels, any written vowels, okay? And so trying to research it was pretty much impossible, but I discovered that Phoenician was very close to Hebrew, which doesn't surprise you at all since they were right there. And so I looked up Hebrew names and I wanted her name to mean something. So I looked at a bunch of names. I also wanted it to be kind of pleasing to the ear because I was going to be spending a long time with this lady. So I came up with the name Adelia. Adelia means, it's an old Hebrew name, and it means, one of the meanings is she who draws water, and the other one is poverty. So, and I love the name, Adelia. Adelia came alive in my mind. She became a real person. And as I wrote this story, and you know, I hope if you read The Last Drop of Oil, she'll become real to you. I love her, and I hope you will too. If you would like to read the story, I know the Owen County Library will have it, and I know that I think they're going to get the ebook as well. They may not have it quite yet, but they will soon. And because it just came out, you know, it just came out not long ago. So I hope that you will contact me. You can go to my website, which is www.virginiasmith.com. and there's a contact page on there. And you can also read about, my other 37 books. And then also I spend way too much time on Facebook. And on Facebook, I am Ginny with a G, Ginny.p.smith. And so you can look me up there. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me and my story. And I really, really hope if you read The Last Drop of Oil that you'll let me know what you think. Thanks a lot.